The Chicago Bears got your hopes up against the Green Bay Packers once again, didn't they? They have a tendency of doing that in those games. The results, still what we're more typically used to. But I think this game against the Packers in particular really showed exactly what the Chicago Bears need to work on moving forward.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today, each and every day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. You pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. First-time users can receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with promo code LOCKEDON. That's prizepicks.com. Promo code Locked On. You can hear in my voice, I'm still on the tail end of what's been a long cold for the last half a week here, but I appreciate you tuning in and following along because I'm powering through, and hopefully we can power through this a little bit together. On the show today, we have to look at what went wrong for the Bears in this game and how I think the Packers found a couple of specific areas to attack both offensively and defensively that I think highlight where the Bears need to focus on. Because I think the Packers put together kind of a path and a game plan for other teams to look at and say, hey, here's how you can beat the Chicago Bears. And so now the Bears have to sort of adjust, adapt, and overcome to not be as vulnerable in some of those areas. So we'll look at where Green Bay kept finding space on offense to be able to move the ball fairly at will at times against this Bears defense. We'll look at what the Bears offense needs to do better, including Justin Fields, but the running game going well and what was working, what wasn't working for that group. And we'll kind of wrap up looking at what to build on. Some of the good things you can take from this game and take them into next week and beyond and say, okay, we've got this figured out. Let's see what we can add to it. But I think it's important in a loss like this to really get at the crux and the heart of why the Chicago Bears lost the game. Because, of course, and after a game like that, you can be mad at the referees, be mad at the missed holding penalties, the missed false starts, a couple of sort of ticky-tacky things in the Bears, some bad spots, maybe the shotgun play on 4th and goal. You can be mad at that play call. You can be mad at the replay, not overturning it and calling it a touchdown. But I don't think collectively that was why the Bears lost the game. Certainly if they score on that 4th and goal, it changes how the game goes from there, and they would have had a chance to potentially win from there, or at least come back and make it closer than it ended up actually finishing. But I think when you want to look at specifically why did the Bears lose this game, you cannot give up 21 points in the second quarter and also score 0 in that same quarter. It was really a stretch of drives there where the Packers scored, I don't think it was back-to-back-to-back. I think it was 3 out of 4. It was touchdown, punt, touchdown, touchdown. And, of course, the Bears had like 3 or 4 straight 3-and-out drives at that point. And I really think that encapsulated a lot of what was going wrong with this Bears defense over that stretch that continued into the second half, right? The game was not decided in the second quarter. The Bears could not come back in the second half, but I think it was very sort of emblematic of what was going on. And I wanted to start with the Bears defense because that's really, a big part of that, giving up 3 touchdowns there. I mean, you need to score more than 10 points to win football games too, and we'll get to the offense as well. But when you look at this Bears defense, first and foremost, way, way, way too many missed tackles. I mean, there were so many plays. I mean, a big part of that running game, the Packers ended up averaging like 8 yards a carry, and I think Aaron Jones was almost like 10 yards a carry as I'm filibustering to pull up his stat number in front of me right now. Yeah, he was 8.8 yards a carry, had 132 yards on 15 carries. As a team, they had 200 yards rushing and 5 yards a carry. And you can't blame that all on missed tackles because the Packers were blocking it well. The Bears weren't getting off blocks very well. But there were so many of those runs where you're hitting them after a yard or two and you're just not bringing them down. Or sometimes they got him in the backfield. Like there was a Kyler Gordon play where he knifed into the backfield and just couldn't make the tackle. And so these runs that should be 2, 3, 4-yard runs become 8, 9, 10-yard runs, and that stacks up over the course of a game, and they're able to march and drive down the field pretty well. But I think specifically it was the way the Packers attacked the Bears in the running game and to some extent in the passing game is that they clearly wanted to get the ball to the edges, get outside, get out of that box, out of the congestion in the middle of the field. And we saw the 49ers have a lot of their success doing the same thing in the week 1 when Elijah Mitchell was getting pitches to the outside or Deebo Samuel, get to the edge and then cut upfield. And the Bears had a lot of trouble containing those outside runs, or when they did get contained, being able to fill when the run would be cut, that first sort of cut downfield and cut to the edge, right? Anytime the Packers were trying to pound it up the middle, or if there was an outside run that got flushed back towards the middle, they did a pretty good job of swallowing those up, generally speaking, certainly compared to those outside runs. But it was the toss plays, it was the stretch zones, and then it was, the little wide receiver screens that go for 20 yards on 2nd and 28, but sometimes it's just the little check down to the flat, found some space there a few times. It seems like the strategy for both the 49ers and the Packers to move the ball against this Bears defense was get the ball to the edges, out in space, make these defensive backs tackle and get your blockers out in front, make them beat blocks and beat tackles. And certainly the Bears were not able to tackle in this game nearly as well as they tackled in that first game against the San Francisco 49ers. And I really think that was such a big part of the formula for beating the Bears. Now, obviously, Aaron Rodgers also made a big part of the formula to just throw at Kyler Gordon as much as humanly possible. I think must have been at least 10 targets in that game. They were clearly going after your rookie slot cornerback. Specifically in that second quarter, the first 2 drives, they threw at Gordon a couple of times, but it wasn't like, oh, Kyler Gordon is the reason they gave up 27 points, or in that quarter, 21 specifically. The third touchdown drive, they got him a couple times. But he also, on that first drive, had a great pass breakup in the end zone. So it was not all bad for your rookie, but it does feel like maybe there's a lot on his plate with him having to play both outside and slot cornerback. Slot's a very, very difficult, might be the more difficult of the 3 spots based on what you're asked to do in the defense. And I can't help but wonder if maybe it would help him to just put him on the outside and just say, just be an outside cornerback, master that, and then from there, we'll see about expanding your role. But your other slot cornerback options, Tavon Young's on injured reserve, and Thomas Graham got signed off your practice squad, so he's out of the building now too. So you got Duke Shelley as a backup, and you might be better off keeping Kindle Vildor in the slot and just rolling with, or keeping Kyler Gordon in the slot and having Kindle Vildor outside and having your 3 best corners on the field. I don't know how much room the Bears have to work with there, and I think they're willing to let Gordon have some of these rookie growing pains and develop on the fly. That seems to be how they're operating with the offense too, having some growing pains, developing on the fly. We'll look at where those growing pains were in this Packers game, what went wrong, and what they can kind of correct, and look forward to building on from this game moving forward next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at PrizePicks, the better way to play daily fantasy football, because it doesn't work like those other daily fantasy setups. In this game, you're not competing against other people, so it's all in your control. It's just you versus the house. You pick 2 to 5 players, and you decide if they'll score more or less than their PrizePicks projection, and you can win up to 10 times your money back on any entry. It's super easy. You can make your picks in 60 seconds or less, get them up even right before kickoff, right? And then when you're ready to withdraw, it's safe and fast to get your money when you win. PrizePicks offers projections not just on Bears games or pro football games, but basketball, baseball, hockey, golf, college sports, WNBA, esports, NASCAR, tennis, you name it. If it's a sport, they have it at PrizePicks. Head on over to prizepicks.com or download the PrizePicks app to sign up and play daily fantasy sports. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100 with you use our promo code LOCKEDON. If you deposit $100, PrizePicks will give you $100. You deposit $50, PrizePicks will give you $50. Don't forget to enter that promo code LOCKEDON at sign-up for an instant deposit match up to $100. 10 points is never going to be enough well, not never, is rarely going to be enough to win a football game, and almost never going to be enough to win a football game against Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. And you can argue whether, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on the whether or not the ball was across the plane on 4th and goal, right? You can look at the screenshots, you can look at the still images, you can identify the brown blur of a ball that appears to be in Justin Fields' hands, and you can draw a line across the goal line and see if that brown blur that we're pretty sure is the football is across the extended line that we draw on from the screenshot and say that should be a touchdown. At the end of the day, the referees didn't call it, and at the end of the day, it was probably a touchdown. If there was a GPS chip in the football and a GPS tracker on the goal line, I think the tracker and the ball would have reached the tracker and the goal line. But they didn't call it. And the Bears challenged it. They gave it everything they could and couldn't get it. And that's at this point, it's just reality, and it's accepted reality. And even 17 points isn't necessarily a lot of what was going to go on. But to my original point, the referee spotting that ball is likely not exactly the reason the Bears lost this game, right? It's not like the Bears went on to score another touchdown, and if they had just scored 7 more, it would have been a difference maker. Yeah, it could have changed the flow of the game, I understand, but we don't know what would have changed from that. But I really think, you're not going to win games passing for 77 yards when it's all said and done. And when we look at then like what kept the Bears from winning this game and why they lost this game offensively, first of all, penalties was humongous. This is not a Bears offense that is prolific enough to overcome penalties. And it wasn't like they had 15 penalties for 300 yards. It finished, I was surprised to see the number ended up only being 7 for 50 yards penalties on the Bears, but it was sort of when and where they came, offensively on those drives, especially the 3 and outs in the second quarter that really felt like the pivotal time in this game, but it continued into the second half. Across the board, the Bears were getting backwards on first down and sometimes second down. And a lot of times it was penalties, but sometimes it just happened to be the play where one player misses his block. Like the offensive line had been run blocking so well for much of the game, but one of those drives in the second quarter, I think it was a David Montgomery toss play for -5 yards, because I don't remember if it was Larry. I think it was Larry Borum, but it's not super important who it was. Somebody on the right side, let Rashawn Gary in, and it was a big tackle for a loss, and it's like they end up getting in these 2nd and 3rd and long situations. And again, this offense is not prolific enough to overcome those types of mistakes that, yes, like on the tackles for losses, it is a good play by the defense, but it also feels a little bit self-inflicted, right? If those plays are instead a run for 2 yards because the defense played it really well and the Bears just couldn't find any room to run, okay, you feel like defense made a nice stop there. But when it's like your offensive lineman loses quickly at the snap, or it's legitimately your fault on a penalty, a false start by Byron Pringle or a holding penalty here, or there was a bad snap to Justin Fields that was just a totally botched, aborted play. Like, you can't, this offense is not good enough to overcome those types of backwards movements on first down to get you in these more difficult 3rd down situations. I think that is then compounded by some conservative play calling. And I've been going back and forth to myself, like in my head, about how I feel about it, because part of me, I get it when, you get to 3rd and 13 and it's the second quarter and maybe you're down, 10-7 or even 17-7 at that point. And, you feel like, okay, we can still play for the second half, and we do want to play the field position game, and we do trust our defense. It's still the first half. There's not a huge urgency to be aggressive. I do get that, but I just can't help but feel like, when it's 3rd and, say it's 3rd and 13, it's one thing. If it's 3rd and 30 and you have no shot at picking up the first down, I understand, hand the ball off on the draw, throw the screen pass, get a better punt, because 30 yards on 3rd down or whatever, pick an arbitrarily large number. Not realistic to expect an offense to do that. But don't you kind of feel like, especially last week, after the sort of broken plays that Justin Fields created, that on anything less than like 3rd and 15, you feel like with Justin Fields, you always kind of have at least a little bit of a chance to pick it up, whether it's, maybe it's not the full 15, but it'll give you 12 and it's 4th and short, and all of a sudden you have a question to ask yourself on whether or not you want to go for it, as opposed to the draw, the screen, the little dump off pass, whatever it is that gets 4 and it's 4th and 11 and you're not going to go for it, right? It just feels like you're sort of compounding the issue when you get into third and long and then still decide not to even try for it. It'd be one thing if, Fields is struggling and had thrown some interceptions and you want to just calm things down or whatever, but we'll talk about his stat line in a little bit, but he was 7-9, before the garbage time, he was 7-9, he was completing his passes, he was taking care of the ball, he was getting decent number of yards based on the attempts, he just wasn't getting to throw it very much. They were running the ball well, that's why there's a lot of why they didn't throw it that much, but it just feels like you make if you're losing on first and second down, and then you basically decide you don't want to try and get the first down on third down, it makes the losing on first and second down worse. If you get those 9 yards on 3rd and 20 for a slightly closer punt or whatever it was, but does those 9 yards on that punt really affect Aaron Rodgers' ability to drive down the field on the next drive? Or, could you take a safe shot downfield on that play? Could you throw a sideline jump ball that either Equinemius St. Brown is going to catch or no one's going to catch, right? Can you find some ways to just get somebody the ball with a real shot at going after the first down instead of just screen pass, draw, quick slant, whatever it might be, that are very clearly low percentage of getting the first down and not, it would take a miracle to get a first down on a play like that. It just seems like, is that not trusting the offensive line? Is that not trusting your receivers? Is it not trusting Justin Fields? And I'm not saying you have to go aggressive on every single third and long, but it just feels like, mix something in there and try and go for it in those situations, especially when those 3 and outs feel like they're stacking and Rodgers is getting some touchdowns here. Can you match some of that aggression the Packers are pushing back on the other side? It's early. It's the second quarter. They're playing the long game. They're playing the field position game. They want to trust their defense. They want to stick to the game plan. I do get it, but I'm still left feeling a little bit frustrated, especially when, there were times when the offensive line was giving Fields some time to throw, and the running game was working with David Montgomery. So it's you're getting some progress here offensively. It's not like nothing is working, but it's part of the growth process for this whole team, trying to go through and figure out what exactly they do and don't have offensively. And then, of course, there's the play call on the goal line. Shotgun versus under center. If it wasn't 4th and inches, maybe I could better understand the call. But when it's literally inches, just use the QB sneak. There's just no reason to do any. If you're going to have Fields run it, Matt Eberflus explained after the game, they like that play call because with Fields as the ball carrier, they pulled an offensive lineman from right to left and had Montgomery as a lead blocker. And so they got more blockers than there were defenders in the box on that half. They had a numbers advantage because Fields becomes an extra player, right? Because Montgomery becomes an extra blocker and they had receivers spread out wide. That's why they called it that way. And that logically does make sense in a vacuum. But it being 4th and inches, just run a QB sneak. For God's sake, it's not that hard. Do the simple, obvious thing. Tom Brady does it all the time, and he's one of the least mobile quarterbacks in the NFL. You don't need to be mobile. It's not about mobility. It's just something you practice, you do it, and you operate it. And I don't. As far as 4th and goal play calls go, I don't hate the QB power. I think the logic there tracks that, yes, it should work. Cole Kmet got blown up on the play, and even Justin Fields probably scored anyway, so it kind of did work. But just run the goddamn quarterback sneak like everybody else. You don't have to be smarter than everybody else. Just do the thing that works way more often than quarterback power. That's what it's all said and done. Would you have been more mad if they had thrown it as opposed to the QB power? I don't know. Or if they handed off an I formation to Dave Montgomery and don't get it, do you feel better about that than this that still got you within, maybe actually did cross the plane and a challenge just couldn't overturn it? It's easy to play armchair play caller and coach from home, but QB sneak seems like the real obvious move there. But we don't have to. That's the thing everyone's going to be mad about today, and I understand. We don't need to hammer on it too much. But what I do want to do is look at what we can build on from this game, because I think there was progress from week 1 to week 2 in some areas for this Bears team, even in a loss. We'll kind of look at some of the positives and some of the things that I think you can start to stack from a game like this next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Turo. Turo is the world's largest car sharing marketplace. With Turo, you can book any car you want, wherever you want it, from a community of local hosts. Browse a huge selection of vehicles for just about any occasion or budget across the U.S. for our listeners in Canada, and also Shout out to our listeners over in UK. You could book a spacious SUV for a family road trip. You can get that like classic or luxury car for maybe it's a birthday, a special event, a holiday, or if you're just on a budget and need to get from point A to point B, plenty of affordable economy cars on Turo as well. Or maybe you're looking to test drive that electric vehicle and see maybe how it might fit in your everyday life. You can test it out with Turo. Many Turo hosts can even deliver the car right to you. Every trip is backed by liability insurance. Terms, conditions, and exclusions do apply. Ditch boring rental cars and find your drive at Turo.com. So obviously there's a lot to bring you down from this Bears-Packers game, but let's look at some of the things that went really well. I think obviously first and foremost, the running game. Specifically, David Montgomery hurt us, right? I mean, we raised the eyebrow on this podcast, last week. Khalil Herbert ran so well, Montgomery didn't. Is this the beginning of the transition? And David Montgomery heard it. I mean, maybe not this podcast specifically, but if you're listening, David, great game. Keep and please join us. Reach out on Twitter, wherever you can. We'd love to have you on the podcast. But no, he's not listening to this podcast. But 15 carries for 122 yards, 8 yards a carry, had just a little bit less than what Aaron Jones had, but a great performance. He just ran hard when the Bears had nothing else going on offense. David Montgomery ran hard. They switched some things up schematically. They went to some gap scheme and some power runs for him that got him a little more downhill. They still mixed in some of the zones and stuff, but he was running hard. He was not going down on first contact. He was making a lot of guys miss tackles as well, and that was really, really good. The Bears were run blocking really well up front as well, a step from where they were last season. I thought Equanimeous St. Brown was blocking again really, really well. He's super valuable in that area in the running game and after the catch in the passing game. Really like what he's been able to do there too. So like that to me has been a big part of this. It's right. We want the Bears to be able to run the ball well so that Fields doesn't have to do as much. Now, that was the case here, but usually the idea is that you run the ball well and score points and win so Fields doesn't have to throw. That second part is the harder part that hasn't quite happened yet. But still, it's very good that the Bears look like they have a running game that they can rely on to move the ball fairly consistently and finish drives maybe inches away from the goal line or across the goal line, depending on how you view that last play. So I think that was good progress there. And even I think when you look at Justin Fields' stat line, you can't sugarcoat it, right? Like he was finished, 7 of 11 for 70 yards, and of course the interception and a 43 passer rating. Like that, in a vacuum, that stat line, not good enough to win a game, of course. You can't pass for 70 yards in a game and expect to win. But that's pretty efficient, right? I mean, like that's a great. I mean, so the interception was in garbage time. Like, if we can just sort of, I don't want to say the interception is meaningless, but like it was the last possession of the game, garbage time interception. Before the garbage time, Fields was 7 of 9, 70 yards, and then the rushing touchdown as well. 7 of 9 for 70 yards is a great first quarter. Like, that's 2 incomplete passes, high completion percentage, good like 10 yards per completion on that, and a little less than that yards per attempt. Like that's taking care of the football. That's, moving the ball a little bit. To me, that's the stat line is more about the sample size. It's the fact that he only attempted 11 passes. Like that's otherwise, like if you just multiply that out over the course of a game, if he throws, 30 passes or say 27 passes, then that would be 21 of 27 if you kept the same completion percentage for 210 yards. If you sort of tripled that over the course of a game, like he was, he was tracking for efficient quarterbacking. He just didn't have many opportunities to quarterback, to throw the football. They just ran the ball so much and had a bunch of 3 and outs that just didn't give him the opportunities to do so. So like, yeah, the interception wasn't great, but it was in garbage time, so I'm not super worried about it. And so like, it wasn't a bad individual passing performance from Justin Fields. He wasn't putting the ball in harm's way. He wasn't particularly inaccurate. He was completing passes. There's a lot of check down and stuff, but that's just what was there for him. I think his pocket presence was a little rough sometimes. Took a couple sacks that he shouldn't have. And, I think did he have a fumble, or am I mixing that up with an Aaron Rodgers play? Regardless, like in the pocket stuff, pre-pass, there were some moments there that needed some work, but like passing, right, was not making poor reads, poor decisions, or totally inaccurate passes. That's something. Wasn't a lot. Not trying to sugarcoat and say he had a great game and that we should all be thrilled or whatever, but not bad overall. Defensively, Travis Gibson sacked Aaron Rodgers twice, beat Elton Jenkins twice. The broadcast kept complimenting how great it was to have Elton Jenkins back, and Travis Gibson whooped his ass twice in the first half. Were those both in the first half? I mean, that was nice plays by Travis Gibson. Angelo Blackson on the defensive line. He made some plays in there in run defense. Got in the backfield a couple times. He's a guy who has thoroughly unimpressed me through his Bears career, but really looked tenacious and physical and aggressive and had the motor going. I really like this Bears defensive line. Has been a pleasant surprise this season, where there haven't been as many pleasant surprises across the board on this defense, but there's things to build on with a young group playing well up front on that defensive line, and still a lot of room for opportunity to grow with the secondary and the young guys on the back end. The other thing that stands out of this game, Bears started fast. Opening drive, touchdown, looked good. Offense was feeling good. That's when you got your hope up, right? When the Bears drove down and took a 7-3 lead in the first quarter and carried it through the end of the first quarter. Packers scored early second quarter, but still, first quarter ended with the Bears in the lead. And how many times in recent years under Matt Nagy have the Bears just struggled to start anything fast, right? I mean, it's just, it'd be the second quarter by the time it felt like the offense showed up. And yes, the Bears could not sustain that strong start, and it wasn't like, again, I'm not trying to pretend everything was great, but it feels good to start the game with a touchdown and feel like there was a rhythm early on there that they could build off of and come back to later in the game. The scripted plays, that kind of stuff was working. And that's something, it's not nothing. The other thing that I think you can build off of or look forward to from here as something to be positive about is reinforcements are on their way. Eventually, Velus Jones will play. He's been injured, hamstring, I think. We're not really sure what the full extent of that is. Hasn't been enough to put him on short-term injured reserve, so we would expect him to be back within the next week or two. He will add a different speed dynamic to this offense, somebody who can get the ball in his hands and see what he can do. He's not going to fix everything, but he will be back, and that should add something. Lucas Patrick, soon, hopefully, will get that cast off of his right hand, should be able to fill in at center and offer some level of upgrade there. We'll see. And also keep in mind, too, that you do have Riley Reif and Michael Schofield as veterans on the bench if Larry Borum has another bad game. Like, I think on first watch, without seeing the tape, I think Larry Borum had a fairly bad game at right tackle. Though I thought Tevin Jenkins played well at right guard, so I'm not as concerned about, say, Michael Schofield needing to go in there at right guard. But you do have options if this young offensive line struggles. You have a couple of veterans on the roster that you could go to that are not going to be Pro Bowl caliber players, but could be a more stabilizing, consistent force, a little bit more of what you're going to get with those guys. So they do have options. And I think overall, right, it's not like the Bears are firing on all cylinders and throwing everything they got against the Green Bay Packers and still not good enough, right? We just haven't seen this Bears team play to its full potential, which is a criticism, but also shows you that this team can be a lot better than we've seen so far. It'd be one thing if Fields is hitting Mooney downfield and the running game's going well and the defense is making stops, but you know what? It's still not good enough because Aaron Rodgers is just that much better. And you kind of say, man, the Packers are just the better team. Like if the Bears were at their full potential, hitting their ceiling, and you're still losing, that's tough. Where do you go from there, right? It's like, well, we threw everything we had at them, still couldn't beat them. You're just a worse team, right? But the Bears haven't done that yet, right? They have not thrown everything. We have not seen this Bears team for 4 quarters or even 3 quarters, play at their full potential. They did enough in the second half against the 49ers, and that first drive, then a couple of drives against the Packers looked like full potential Bears. But we haven't really seen like, we've thrown everything we got at you, Bears, yet, right? Like, so I think that's another reason to sort of feel like there's stuff to build on here, that we haven't seen this team play as good as they can play. We haven't seen these players all at their absolute best yet, and that's reason to think they can and should still get better from here. Certainly we'll dive into this game and break it down even more. We'll go through the All-22 film on tomorrow's podcast, so make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making the Locked On Bears podcast your first listen today and each and every day. If you're looking for our second listen, check out the rest of our Locked On Chicago sports shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day. That includes your Chicago Bulls, your Chicago Blackhawks, your Northwestern Wildcats, your Illinois Fighting Illini, and so many more. We've got your sports covered across the network here on Locked On, so go check those out for your second listen today. Come on back tomorrow for your first listen, Locked On Bears. Come on back for that opportunity to bear down.